If you clicked on this video, I just wanted to say thank you and subscribe for some more Red Dead content. This is not stuff that I normally upload, and for some provided context, this series or these types of videos are basically just compilations of videos that are already up on the channel. Just making it easier for people to binge watch everything when it comes to character analysis or breakdowns or deeper looks at relationships from one character to another. Just to make it all easier and more digestible, and to combine the individual videos as more of a complete series as a long form video, so that way you could just put on in the background, go to sleep, go to work, do whatever you need to do. This one here is all tied into looking into the character and overall personality of Micah, his intentions as well. We look at whether if Micah had a hand in kidnapping Arthur for Colm during their meetup, and if Micah was always a rat, or did Milton lie about that? Did Sadie John make the right decision in killing Cleet due to his blatant affiliation to Micah? Is it automatically guilty by association and there was no chance of redemption? Micah, I think, is one of the more complex characters in the overall story of Red Dead Redemption 2, so this entire video is dedicated to him and the many different hands and the many different roles or lack thereof that he may or may not have played in throughout the main story. Anyways, I'll shut that all up. Thank you so much for watching. There's going to be chapters for each individual video. If you want to jump around, or if you just want to watch this entire thing, it's perfectly fine as well, but enjoy. It's honestly pretty interesting to think of how passionately people get over something like a video game character. The protagonist or character that you play as makes sense for people to get attached to. People spend anywhere from 20 to 40 hours plus playing as them, and through good storytelling and character development, they become someone real, basically. You get attached to them. You know their wants, their needs, their desires, you feel for them, and in a way that's not too different than a close friend. It's the difference between having a character that's just tolerable or maybe even completely likable. A good example for someone like this would be Joel from The Last of Us, for me particularly. You know his backstory, who he is, where he comes from, and the mentality he has entering this apocalyptic world that has fallen apart. His life, his world was ripped apart, and the moment he lost his daughter Sarah, he became hardened by grief, distant, unemotional. His sole drive was just to survive from the moment his daughter died moving forward. He was a completely different person. It's not until the progression of that game's story and spending so much time with Ellie that Joel's character arc, well, essentially a full circle, because at the end of the game, his hardened shell was cracked and he has pretty much taken up a role of being a father figure to Ellie. But what he was before the world went to hell, he is again. Albeit the circumstances are, of course, undeniably different. The world is still a cold, hard, and dangerous place, but he is capable and willing to do whatever it takes to protect his daughter, Ellie, a girl that's actually not too far off from the age his daughter was when she died. Joel becomes likable, and his character development, while being a full circle, is still one that makes him likable, and his goals and reasons for doing what he does, while they may be questionable, are still very much understandable. I like Joel, and I believe he's a large part as to why that game is so great. He's not a bad character by any means. I think it's quite the contrary. But when you look at someone like Joel compared to, say, Arthur Morgan, where Arthur's character development and the circumstances of his shifting priorities and mentality behind it, I would say makes him a great character, especially because of the pacing in which he's developed in. The first 5 hours or so of Red Dead Redemption 2 spent basically making him seem like a mindless brute. Terrifying and antagonistic is all he's really seen as. That, and of course loyal, but when we see he's got a love interest, and the reason as to why he has a certain position against John isn't because of some dumb rivalry on who does more for the gang that they're in, or who's in the good graces of Dutch, but rather why he's so standoffish against John is because he's hurt. He was so easily tossed away and forgotten about by someone who he considered a genuine brother. That actually hurt him, and he hid that hurt behind the code of the gang, that they're meant to be and stay loyal to each other and to Dutch. But deep down, why he continued to give John so much shit and told him to leave again, ultimately it was just his pain and anger manifesting into pushing his brother away. Of course, there's other differences where we actually see Arthur pass away on screen, and he's got other relationships tied to John, Charles. There's a mesh up of his life before he got sick, and how his life is spiraling out of control while he's slowly approaching his deathbed. So circumstances are a little different between Arthur and Joel. The material is drastically different, but as I was saying, there's a contrast between a good character and a great one. And whenever you're dealing with a great character, typically if there's anyone that's antagonistic or oppositional to him, that might seem to be the polar opposite, or the story's being told through that particular character's perspective, naturally we're going to have a biased view. We all accept our character's view, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when the character's done so well, and you feel for them on so many different levels, it becomes difficult for people to see the opposing view, especially from the side of the person irritating us, or irritating the main character that we're playing as. In this case, that's Micah Bell.
Go easy on him, Morgan. He was out trying to find a lead, same as you, same as Hosea. All you do is complain when things don't work out, except when it's your goddamn fault.
You don't know what you're talking about. You don't give a damn about nobody but yourself.
Oh, you act so high and mighty, but you're no better than the rest of us.
It's funny how well Rockstar has made Micah such a hated character. I wouldn't describe him as bad, because I don't think he's bad. At least not as a character. A bad person, definitely, but to give you an idea of how hated Micah is, I mean, you cannot give him any kind of credit whatsoever without someone talking shit for defending this piece of shit. But the one thing I think Micah never gets credit for is he never changes. Arguably, he's the most static character throughout the beginning to the end of the game. The only difference I would say that Micah really has is that there's a sense of confidence and a heightened level of impunity thanks to how close he's become with Dutch. But seemingly everyone goes through changes with the exception of him. Arthur and John go through changes. John becomes more dedicated to Jack and Abigail, something that's immediately noted after Jack's kidnapping at the hands of the Braithwaites and Angela Bronte. Arthur changes for a number of reasons, mixed with his declining health, a small resuscitation to his love interest with Mary Linton, regret over the Downs family and Dutch's growing recklessness. Dutch changes, even smaller characters such as Lenny, Sadie, Charles. But Micah never really does. Seemingly from the very moment you first see him on screen, he's seen as someone who enjoys the torment of others. He messes with Sadie when he finds her hiding out at her ranch and finds pleasure in tormenting this woman that's not only terrified but completely vulnerable. As early as Coulter, Micah makes comments on how unfair it is that here he is doing all this work, bringing in all this money for Dutch, for the gang, and yet, still somehow, there are other people that are not earning their own keep, that are freeloading, that are taking it easy off of all of his hard work. And that, of course, is Micah's position on the women and Jack. And because they're being freeloaders, it's up to him to pick up the slack. This is kind of a sentiment that Micah repeats throughout the game. It's somewhat hand in hand with going back and reclaiming the money that was lost in Blackwater, just taking the money and shedding the dead weight. He even repeats it again during Beaver Hollow, contributing to Dutch's final decision to just let Abigail be hanged for murder when she's captured by Agent Milton. There's even a point where he sarcastically mentions how he cares so much for the gang and all of its members and he just can't help it.
Maybe he's right, Dutch. Maybe I have pushed too hard. Got us into situations that could have been safer. I see all those mouths we gotta feed, and I dream too big, caring too much. That's my problem.
Caring too much? There's no such thing.
Granted, Dutch plays along with it and echoes Micah's sentiment, which in the moment just seems like the two of them are jokingly bullshitting, but as a joke or otherwise. Where Micah stands and how he feels is something that is immediately apparent from the start. He never has a change of heart, a character evolution, a change of who he was or what he valued like Dutch, or even a shift in priorities like John and Arthur. Instead, what we get is a deeper look at who he has always been. I've mentioned before that Micah is, well, unforgettable, somewhat sparse if you really look at it. During Horseshoe Overlook, he's only present in 2 missions. One involves saving him at Dutch's request, a mission that further sets the tone of his willingness to kill and take back what's his, no matter who stands in his way. It's also the first real interaction between him and Arthur that we see.
I got an opportunity to watch you be silenced.
Well, you gotta do something.
Why?
I always looked up to you, Arthur.
Well, that's your first mistake.
You can sense the tension between the two of them. He's understandably submissive towards Arthur here because, well, his life obviously depends on it, but he continues to have a submissive demeanor towards Arthur, even though it's somewhat agitating. It's still harmless. It's not quite the level of disrespect that he later displays, but the general disposition towards him is still the same.
Well, the gang gets its piece.
Yeah. Like I said, big shadow, tiny tree.
And like I said, that still don't mean nothing.
In the next chapter of Clement's Point, again, Mike is only present in 2 missions, technically 3, as he defends the camp with Kieran while everyone else goes to launch an assault on Braithwaite Manor while looking for Jack. Now, I don't really consider that all too significant, and if we want to add some deeper meaning to this, that honestly probably doesn't exist. The whole assault on Braithwaite Manor I consider an apex moment in terms of unity of the Vanderlyn gang. I mean, this shot of all of them walking up to Braithwaite Manor is still one of the coolest moments in the entire game. I think it's only second to everyone riding down from the hilltop onto the oil refinery in My Last Boy. But all of the enforcers are present. The only 2 here that aren't is a former O'Driscoll that's more of a horse groomer than an actual gunman, and then of course Micah. That in of itself could be the developers giving us a representation of Micah's loyalty. Anyways, apart from that, Micah was crucial in convincing Dutch to meet up with Colm, resulting in Arthur's kidnapping. Now, there's no direct evidence that Micah played a part in it, although it is one of the first suspicious moments of Micah actually taking an initiative to get rid of Arthur. Again, there's never 100% indisputable proof that Micah had an actual hand in Arthur's kidnapping and subsequent torture, but the circumstances surrounding it and Dutch's lack of finding it odd that Arthur just didn't turn up, supplemented by Micah's indifferent demeanor to the condition Arthur is in when he does return to camp, definitely makes one wonder. His only other one major appearance in Clement's Point is during a short walk in a pretty town where he, Bill, Arthur, and Sean all get ambushed by the Gray family. During the chapter of Saint Denis, there's a stagecoach stick-up that you can do with Micah, but as far as the main missions go, he's only present during the robbery of the Bank of Saint Denis. He's obviously present during the entire chapter of Gorma, but neither the entire chapter of Gorma or the Saint Denis bank robbery does he have any notable presence. He's there, yes, but the spotlight is put more on the rest of the gang members, and of course Dutch, who's having more and more of a looser grip on his own values. Something that Arthur is obviously witnessing, contributing to Arthur's own introspection and reevaluation. Micah's biggest presence is during the chapter of Beaver Hollow, at least as far as missions go. He's never seen in more than 2 missions at a time, with the exception of Gorma, but while being present in as nearly as many missions as he is in Beaver Hollow, he still doesn't have that much of an on-screen presence. He more so blends into the background. It's Beaver Hollow where he doubles down on how he is during Horseshoe Overlook. It's the catering to Dutch and getting in Arthur's face, albeit more disrespectful and willing to put Arthur in his quote-unquote place. But if the roles were reversed during Horseshoe Overlook and Micah would be Dutch's right-hand man, as he is in Beaver Hollow, I don't think he would act any different towards Arthur than he does here. It may be dialed back a bit since Arthur isn't sick and there would be more members readily available to defend him from Micah, and Dutch would be less inclined to support the way Micah talks, at least openly, since the pressure on him is not only there to the level that it is during Beaver Hollow, but we have a more coherent gang, a gang that resembles more of a family. The women are still around, Jack is still around, Hosea is still alive. There would be more of a fuss for Micah treating Arthur the way that he does. Really, many people in this game aren't actually seen in too many missions if you think about it. The only ones in a majority of them is Arthur, obviously because the game takes place through his own account, and of course Dutch. To think that Micah has such a minuscule presence during the middle of the game's events and still manages to have the presence and irritation from us as if he's always around is a testament to how Rockstar skillfully utilized the little time that they may be given with each character to not only set the tone of a certain relationship's dynamic, but the basics of that character's personality. Another thing I want to point out that someone said that Micah doesn't get enough credit for is just how smart he is. He understood this gang's dynamic. He understood the culture and the morals, the values, and that Dutch was the center of it all. Whether if Micah genuinely had a love and dedication to Dutch is debatable. I feel he genuinely did, although just because he had that love and dedication doesn't mean he had that same level of loyalty and willingness to protect and defend Dutch over himself. But ultimately, in the end, while many people find him annoying and irritating, I find Micah to be one of the more interesting characters, just how he's presented. As I said, he's not a bad character. Bad guy, yes. He's an interesting character with no morals, very few values, and a person whose goals and interests sometimes may be a little gray or shady, but ultimately, I still find his presence interesting. It's hard to think of how the game would be if we didn't have someone like Micah. At times, it's almost like you actually need him. Arthur's really not someone that's challenged all too often, and now we have this thorn in our side in the presence of Micah, who likes to annoy, likes to agitate. But let me know what you think. What's your position on Micah? Do you agree with me? Do you feel like he doesn't change at all during the story? He just becomes more of who he was from the start? And do you think the story of Red Dead Redemption 2 ultimately needs Micah? I'll be down in the comment section talking to you, and like always, I just want to say thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.
I know we ain't always seen eye to eye, and you find me irritating and a threat, and I like to annoy you. But right now, I need better from you, Arthur.
Okay, Micah, whatever you say.
I ain't the bad guy you think I am, Arthur. But I am a survivor. Stick with me and you'll live.
What does it mean to be a survivor? What are you willing to do in order for self-preservation? To make sure you long outlast those around you. Those who you have fought, bled, and sacrificed besides, not as enemies, but as brothers. Micah Bell is often considered to be the most hated person in all of Red Dead Redemption 2. Given how the entire game is presented through the eyes of Arthur, the polar opposite of Micah, it's not hard to see why. Micah agitates and indirectly challenges Arthur in the early hours of the game.
Make sure the gang gets its piece.
Yeah. Like I said, big shadow, tiny tree.
And like I said, that still don't mean nothing. Get out of here.
Micah also disrupts the overall status quo and hierarchy within the gang by appealing to the narcissistic and even latent vengeful side of Dutch, resulting in Dutch making decisions he would have originally brought to the Council of Hosea and taken some sort of opinion of Arthur's, whether if it was through sheer gratitude for saving his life, seeing how useful Micah could be in the right situations, or Micah was someone for once that really understood a side of him that has always wanted to just give in to his own impulsiveness. Maybe it was a combination of all the three. Whatever the case, Dutch took a liking to this man. A man who possibly never even held the smallest amount of loyalty to Dutch. Micah could very well be loyal to none other than himself, and of course, his most valued possessions, his 2 custom Schofield revolvers with "Vengeance is hereby mine" engraved on the barrels. If Micah was to ever make it out of this life, betraying Dutch, along with every other Vanderlyn gang member in the process, what life he had hoped to live would only be up to speculation. Given his own temperament and irrational behavior, prone to emotional outbursts, it's hard to imagine him living all that long, or even continuing a life on the low. A life of peaceful domestication isn't exactly something that seems would suit him all that well. And seeing how John has to put down scores of Micah's own men during the epilogue, I think it's safe to say Micah would possibly never give living a normal life a fair shot. Either being jailed and hanged, as was his fate in Strawberry, or really dying in a hail of bullets is what seems to always be waiting for him. Or even potentially hunted down like an animal by Pinkertons, realizing just how much of a problem he really is. It's doubtful Micah could ever live a normal life. While that may be an interesting topic to explore in the future, today I want to talk about Micah's allegiance, or lack thereof, to Dutch. I don't exactly want to challenge the notions of Micah already being a traitor or a rat. I think that is something entirely different. What I want to do is present with different scenarios to question the legitimacy of each individual piece of evidence of Micah's questionable allegiance and look at each one under a microscope, starting with the first big flag, Dutch's wanted poster that can be found in Micah's camp. After saving Micah from the jail cell in Strawberry, Micah continues to live remotely in the local area, scouting for potential opportunities where he can return to Dutch with a big take. Some type of gift, a form of repentance for his mistakes, if you will. And so, Micah places his sights on a local banking coach set to travel by soon. Here, the events of the mission and American pastoral scene begin to unfold. Once the mission is complete, it has come to people's attention that if you return to where Micah was camped out at, there is a wanted poster with none other than Mr. Dutch Vanderlyn as the bounty. For some, a telltale sign of Micah's intentions to give this man up since the very beginning. However, maybe that isn't entirely true. Micah is said to have stepped in and saved Dutch's life when they first met each other up in the Grizzlies. And after reading this poster, the first opportunity to betray Dutch would have been right there in that bar in the initial encounter. There was no need to save Dutch, who was already about to be killed. Micah could have very well let that happen, and then kill Dutch's assailants and take the bounty for himself, possibly the best route to take, as it would end up as the least path of resistance and a healthy payday. The great Dutch Vanderlyn's corpse can be turned in, and Micah can ride off, saddlebags loaded with cash with only a few bullets spent. Micah does the opposite though. and decides to save this silver-tongued fox. Why? Maybe it was a message Dutch preached. Maybe it was what he stood for. Or maybe it was as simple as Micah knew he couldn't survive on his own. And as Dutch saw Micah as someone who could be very useful in some situations, Micah saw Dutch as someone who could open doors to him and provide the one thing he couldn't get on his own: a loyal gang. One who he could rely on. One who, if need be, he can call a family.
I'm sorry, but we're family now. Arthur, you and me. Sons of Dutch. Makes us brothers. Sometimes, brothers make mistakes.
Whatever the case, Micah chose to save him that night, and he chose to continue on to ride with the gang. Now, the reason I call back to this particular scenario is because if we take a look at the bounty on Dutch's head, it's priced at only $1,000, which to me signals that this is something that predates the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. Micah's been aware of who Dutch was, and the reason why I believe it predates it is because of two reasons. First, Milton prices Arthur's own bounty at $5,000. Milton's determined to bring only Dutch down, giving the rest of the gang members ample time to disperse and maybe even try a fair chance at living a normal life. In Milton's words, a life worthy of human beings. We can say that sure, Milton maybe priced Arthur's own bounty a little higher as a form of intimidation or some kind of attempt to convince Arthur all the trouble he's willing to bring down on himself ultimately isn't worth it, because while his bounty may be so high, Milton is only after Dutch. Find it hard to believe Arthur's own bounty would be higher than the man who is considered the main culprit behind these many crimes. The literal gang is named after Dutch, and Milton was willing to excuse each and every single member for just Dutch alone. I doubt with so much attention and heat, even if in the off chance Arthur's bounty was higher, Milton would excuse it all for just Dutch by himself. On the same token, with the Vanderlyn gang hitting Cornwall's train at the end of the chapter of Coulter, and Cornwall becoming a direct financier of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, with Cornwall's influx of money, interest, and the fact the gang was already wanted on the run from what transpired in Blackwater, a $1,000 bounty seems way too low. Micah would also be too far involved with the gang at this point and its own affairs to be having any sort of poster like this within his possession. Even if he did, ready to present it to the law or even a rival gang if need be to save his own neck, this poster wouldn't be the evidence for that. The bounty's way too low for it to be valid after the events of the game have already started to take place. So I personally don't believe this bounty is entirely relevant. It can be, but I think when you take everything into consideration, it has to be before the events of Red Dead Redemption 2. And then there's a matter of the next flag. Micah's absence in the earlier hours of the game and his refusal to stand his ground, or even take major action when the gang needs him most. I have pointed out before Micah's lack of action when Arthur went missing after he, Dutch, and Micah decided to ride out and meet with Colm. Even though it was a meeting that was orchestrated by Pearson, the fact Micah seemed so willing and eager to push Dutch to sue for peace, a direct contradiction to Micah's own rash, aggressive tendencies. He of all people should understand the hatred that Dutch has for Colm, yet in a twist of fate, he appears to push Dutch so hard to at least hear Colm out. In a previous video, I mentioned how despite Arthur, Dutch, and Micah all agreeing to a meetup point after the meeting with Colm took place, as a sort of safety measure, Arthur obviously didn't make it to this meetup, and yet neither Dutch nor Micah decided to go and look out for Arthur, who was missing. Yet, unbeknownst to Dutch, at least, Arthur was in the possession of Colm, trying to use him as bait to turn Dutch and his men into the law in order to buy himself time.
Let me go, Colm, and end all this crap between you two. We all got real problems now.
The way I see it, they get him, they forget about me.
Whether if Micah had a direct or indirect hand in this for certain can be debatable. At least that was a stance some people had before. But what can't be argued is Micah's lack of initiative to mount a rescue mission for who he claimed was his quote-unquote brother. It's also quite apparent at Arthur's return to camp, Micah can be seen in the background, completely unbothered by Arthur's return. Sure, it could be viewed as Micah's attempt to get rid of Arthur. By doing nothing or refusing to get up or rile Dutch up to go and look out for Arthur was potentially his way of trying to push Arthur's absence under the rug. With Arthur gone, after all, Micah would have unrivaled access to Dutch, and with that, the ear of the will of the Vanderlyn gang. On the one hand, this was a move to show to Arthur just how much Micah truly cared for him. Arthur saved his skin back in Strawberry, although at the behest of Dutch. Now, even though he is technically indebted to Arthur, here he is, refusing to do the same. It's one thing to quietly trying to get rid of an obstacle like Arthur. However, it's a completely different thing when you refuse to back up the other members as he does later on. This is actually a moment that has passed over my head countless times, and it wasn't until recently that it was brought to my attention. The battle of Sadie Bell picks up immediately after the Vanderlyn gang burns down Braithwaite Manor. Revenge for kidnapping young Jack Marston. This is the mission where Milton and Ross walk in the heart of the Van der Linde camp, confront Dutch, threaten every member here, and even offer a deal. Surrender Dutch, and they all get to walk. This singular cutscene displays what is possibly the greatest level of unity the gang has ever had for each other and even for Dutch. Dutch lets his oratory skills run on full display, mockingly offering to give himself up, only for every single Van der Linde member to load and cock all of their weapons.
Ain't that fine?
I don't want to kill all these folk, Dutch. Just you.
In that case, it'd be my honor to join you. Excuse me, friends. I have an appointment to keep with...
Dutch may be a wanted man, their homes may have been discovered, and they will be damned if these men of the law foolishly believe Dutch would be given up without a fight. Every member, from the trusted adopted sons such as Arthur and John, down to the less trusted and even feeble-minded members such as Strauss, Reverend, and Kieran, all stand shoulder to shoulder, ready for a fight, except Micah. Micah's not only absent from this entire scene, but he can even be seen walking in the background, leisurely heading for his horse. Some, similar to the wanted poster, has cited this as another pivotal moment where Micah was a rat all along, luring the Pinkertons here and refusing to fight them when he already struck a deal. However, again, I don't think that is entirely true. It's plausible for sure, but seeing how Milton's introduction to the gang members goes to show he doesn't quite know who is who or even potentially how many members hold the ranks of the Van der Linde gang, he doesn't know who John is, he presumes Hosea, and the only person that he knows besides Arthur is Dutch.
Good day, fine people. Mr. Van der Linde, Mr. Matthews, I presume. And who are you?
Rip Van Winkle.
Huh. Good day, sir.
Micah could be very well aware of this, and rather than fight, stand his ground with people who are staring in the face of a reckoning. All their days are numbered. Maybe he knew Dutch was a very wanted man, only growing in infamy, and the reality of this man being killed or captured was high, and only continuing to grow day by day, worsening as long as they had no money and continued to go score to score. He may not have sold them out to the Pinkertons just yet, but he wasn't ready to take the chance of being assigned a death sentence with the Van der Linde members. As he said himself time and again, he is a survivor after all. But if that's true and he's not ready to stand his ground with the Van der Linde gang, that raises one question. By him going out, revealing his face in the Saint Denis bank robbery, a robbery that most likely Milton or any other surviving Pinkerton members could have seen his face, what next? Well, that paints the next scenario in a different light. As we all know, during the end of the game, when Arthur goes to save Sadie and Abigail from Milton, Milton reveals to Arthur that Micah has been a rat all along. Milton picked up Micah back when they returned from the island of Guarma. And ever since then, Micah's been revealing information to the Pinkertons. There is so much that can be broken down about this interaction. So many people refuse to believe that Milton could even be lying to Arthur, which I think was always a possibility, but we'll leave that for a different video entirely. Let's talk about Micah revealing information to Milton. We don't know the details. We don't know the extent, we don't know the nature, we don't know the quality of the information, the type of communication that was being kept between them, or how close of an eye Milton and the Pinkertons were even keeping on Micah. So far, the picture I have painted, though, is one that admits Micah doesn't have undying loyalty to Dutch, something that's been pretty much common sense. He doesn't care about any of the other members, or even Dutch to a degree. His main concern is himself, and he's aware of how far he can go with and without Dutch. I believe Micah was aware that he needed and depended on Dutch, and counted on Dutch's good graces and the love and respect Dutch commanded from other people to ensure that he himself was taken care of. If Micah betrayed the gang and really did feed information to the Pinkertons behind everyone's back, I believe the information Micah would have given the Pinkertons would have been information that was credible, something that was just enough to ensure if things went south with Dutch or the gang and they all ended up at the mercy of the law, he could then claim he was a double agent. On the flip side, in order to save face with Dutch, seeing how during Beaver Hollow, Micah starting to call the shots and even making moves on behalf of Dutch, it wouldn't be too difficult for him to place Arthur and even John on the types of jobs that would cause more, in Dutch's words, noise. The jobs where the gang was being more bold, more ambitious, more careless. In this way, Micah could claim to Dutch, Arthur, and John were conspiring against him and were in contact with the Pinkertons, something Dutch already admitted to having a suspicion of when they were trapped on the island of Guarma.
So what happened with John in that bank?
He survived. Unlike dear Hosea and Lenny, the only one they took alive. Why is that, you think?
I don't know. I was already on the roof. I didn't see it.
And Abigail, I presume she was able to slip away in time.
What are you talking about?
You know, when I look back at all the chaos of the past few weeks, the apparent superficial chaos, I begin to wonder, maybe, for somebody, this is all going exactly to plan.
Later on, during just a social call, Micah continues to plant the idea that there is a rat.
Micah reckons there's a rat.
Oh, does he? On what evidence?
He's only back a minute. Pinkertons show up.
We've been on the run since you two fools went crazy in Blackwater.
At this point in time, Dutch has already shown a growing coldness towards Abigail and John. It was just a bigger hurdle to convince Dutch Arthur was in the same camp as well, something Arthur gradually was put in by just being placed on the same jobs as John, and even in Dutch's eyes continuing to side with John, such as saving him from Cynic Penitentiary, and even insisting that Dutch should let the Marstons go. Micah this way was put in a uniquely blessed position. Anything went wrong in Dutch's eyes can be placed on the Marstons and Arthur. Anything went wrong in the Pinkertons' eyes, Micah could play the role of an insignificant gunman that knew nothing of Dutch's grander ideas, and fed as much information as he possibly could to them. After all, from our perspectives, there's no evidence saying concretely that the Pinkertons were aware of who Micah was, or his affiliation with the Vanderland gang, or even a personal tie to Dutch. At the end of the day, Micah being a rat wasn't to serve the Pinkertons, it wasn't to serve Dutch, or really destroy the Vanderland gang. I believe with Micah's own philosophy, he was willing to do any and everything to ensure that he survived, that he made it through the day, and that meant being all too willing to play both sides. Micah's selfish, Micah's hot-headed, he's temperamental, but he's not an idiot. And I'm going to present this to you. What do you think about all this? What do you think the position Micah was in? And how do you perceive the wanted poster, Micah's lack of action when it came to Arthur being taken for a hostage, the Pinkertons showing up in the heart of the Clemens Point camp, or even the validity of Milton claiming that Micah was a rat? And even if that is true and Micah was indeed the rat, what do you think the information was? What do you think the role Micah played as a rat? Do you agree with the perspective I have? How much does it differ? Let's talk down in the comment section below. But like always, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name is Cynic. If you have any suggestions or recommendations or anything else you want me to cover, doesn't even necessarily have to be Red Dead Redemption 1 or 2. Please share it down below in the comments. But until next time, I'll see you all later.
What are we doing here, Colm? Is this thing over?
Was there ever a real possibility of a long-lasting truce taking place between Colm and the Vanderland gang? Or was this event the brainchild of both Colm and Micah? Colm clearly had the law on his tail, with his men causing much more problems for the local town they camped next to. His men can be found beating people and setting up traps out in the countryside with little accountability or any type of rule enforcement on Colm's part. Or this all could have been encouraged by him. Either way, Colm without any doubt finds himself in somewhat the same position as Dutch, possibly even being on Leviticus Cornwall's hit list with his name right next to his older brother in arms. I doubt the train the Vanderland gang stole from them in the opening chapter of Coulter was their only planned robbery that was fully intended to be carried out. I'm sure there were many more other hits on Cornwall's property, fueling Cornwall's rage and boosting the wave of funding he supplied to the Pinkertons. Micah, on the other hand, there's no secret his relationship with Arthur is fragile at best, fighting to be Dutch's #1 adopted son and command the most respect in the Vanderland gang, next to Dutch of course. Arthur's nothing more than an obstacle to what Micah wants most. Now, with Colm in his presence, it's time for the two of them to get what they want, and that's with Colm getting the law off his tail to buy a little time so he can disappear, or at the very least be considered less of a priority in the law's eyes. Micah, on the other hand, wanted to no longer be challenged, with full reign over Dutch and tailoring everything Dutch heard to ensure Micah got what he wanted, with Dutch's unwavering support. Unwavering support that can only be achieved with Arthur gone, and if whatever they were after was retold in a way that at least sounded consistent with Dutch's teachings. Whatever the case, today I wanted to explore the events of the mission Blessed Are the Peacemakers. This mission takes place during Chapter 3 at Clement's Point. The Van der Linde gang finds themselves in the middle of using the Braithwaites and Gray's hatred against each other for their own personal gain, and a valiant effort to swoop the rumored Confederate gold out from under these families. The mission finds us right in the middle inside of the Van der Linde camp, with Micah proposing something that's actually very inconsistent with his character.
Colm O'Driscoll, have you lost your minds?
You're always telling us, Dutch, do what has to be done, but don't fight wars ain't worth fighting.
They want a parley? It's a trap.
Well, of course, it's probably a trap, but what do we got to lose finding out?
I always found this mission a little odd, and how Micah acts to be suspicious at best. Never mind the meetup with Colm was only handled with Micah, Dutch, and Arthur standing over watch in the distance, with no contingency plan made to involve any other gang members whatsoever should anything go wrong, but we'll dismiss this and chalk it up to Dutch swiftly making that decision on his own. Perhaps it was in a fit of agitation and doubt that he decided to involve as few people as possible that felt like a personal matter between two bitter enemies, completely disregarding all the bloodshed that did involve every gang's members over the years. But Mike is strangely optimistic about this. The man who, back in Strawberry, killed O'Driscolls in a drunken haze, or out of pure rage, or did it to just ingratiate himself more with Dutch for taking out members of his mortal enemy's gang. We'll never know the true reason behind all this, but it's hard to believe that the man who preaches cutting the weaker, lesser members loose from the gang and sees any kind of mercy as weakness is now begging Dutch to turn a blind eye and try to forgive a man for something he would never even consider doing. Micah, on the way to the meetup, even starts repeating the same sentiments Dutch always has.
I see all those mouths we gotta feed, and I dream too big, caring too much. That's my problem.
Caring too much? There's no such thing.
This is horse shit from both of you.
He says it all sarcastically, and is rightfully called out by Arthur. And we know through the events of the game, the entire Van der Linde gang believed this to be a trap Colm later confirmed to Arthur to be true, yet it wasn't the type of trap anyone expected. The trap here was to capture Arthur so Dutch and the rest of the Van der Linde gang would come to his rescue, only to be greeted by Pinkertons waiting for them. I've already established Micah and Colm's intentions and the mutual benefit of them orchestrating this trap together. However, there's one glaring issue here. It's not Micah that had originally presented the peace offering to Dutch, but Pearson. Pearson claims he followed some O'Driscolls into town, and it almost erupted into a fight until they started talking, and a possible peace was pitched. Unless these O'Driscoll members, for some odd reason, found it in the kindness of their hearts to not attack on sight, as they normally would if they were aware that this was a member of Dutch's gang they were dealing with, or maybe they took pity on Pearson or found him more amusing than threatening, and maybe they were smarter than the average O'Driscoll, it's really possible that there was a lot done within this actual interaction between Pearson and these O'Driscolls, or even through these members by chance hearing of Colm trying to plan something out, and these members, in an attempt to get in Colm's good graces, preemptively established this meeting through making contact with Pearson. While all of that is definitely possible, I think it's less likely, given how Mike is acting specifically. What I believe to be the case is, even this chance meetup between Pearson and the O'Driscolls was staged. In a previous video, I talked about how Micah is unaccounted for during most of the chapters of 2 and 3. In Chapter 3, the only time we really see Micah is during Blessed Are the Peacemakers and a short walk in a pretty town. Given how he acts in Chapter 2, doing so as he pleases, and when things go south, he returns to Dutch with some sort of peace offering or a gift to alleviate the wrongdoing he's done, I believe the meetup with Colm to be one of those instances, with an added benefit of completely removing Arthur. Perhaps he ran into a situation where he found himself at odds with O'Driscolls and decided to broker some type of deal within Colm. Maybe they hunted him down, knowing that he was the one that enacted all the events at Strawberry, and they found him alone. Whatever the case, the law wants Colm, but they want Dutch even more. Dutch isn't an easy capture and undoubtedly won't leave the camp without any kind of decent level of protection, so even if he does leave camp and they manage to capture him, Arthur would easily be the head of a vengeful rescue contingent. So it's easier then to make Dutch come to us. Even if this was the case, I don't fully believe that Micah was willing to completely give up on Dutch and let that happen to him. If we look at the events of the end of Blessed Are the Peacemakers, when Arthur makes his way back into the Van der Linde camp, there's almost no sort of action that's being taken by anybody within the camp. Even though Arthur himself said that if anything goes south or whenever this meeting ends, we will meet at the fork in the road. Micah and Dutch had to have known that Arthur obviously didn't make it. And we're not deep enough to the story to see any type of falling out between Dutch and Arthur, or see any reason for Dutch to give up on Arthur as he does in the later stages of the game. Besides, Hosea is still alive. I'd imagine Hosea and John would have definitely acknowledged that Arthur's been missing for a couple days and riled up the rest of the camp into trying to look for him. So I don't actually believe that Dutch willingly ignored this. I think if any concerns or any problems came up to his mind, either Micah completely put them at ease, or Dutch was so involved and agitated from the events of the meeting with Colm that he just couldn't be bothered or preoccupied with what happened to Arthur, not really thinking anything more of it, and perhaps, he'll just see them later at the camp. But either way, I've always believed that this is the way that's how the meeting went. I think Colm fully intended to capture Dutch, give him to the Pinkertons, so that way he can escape and get some of the heat off him. I really think the way that he planned on doing that was using Arthur as bait. However, I don't believe Micah would have ever allowed Dutch to get himself captured. I think Micah would have let it be until Dutch became aware of the situation, and I think at that point Micah would have either convinced him that it wasn't worth it, or again, because Hosea and John are alive, with them very much advocating to rescue Arthur, I believe that Micah would have put himself at the front of a rescue mission and would have done pretty much exactly what he did with John at the end of the game. During the We Are Best Selves mission, when John is on the train and he gets shot, Micah claims that there was nothing he can do, that John died. And I think that Micah would have done the exact same thing here with Arthur. I think he would have done the absolute bare minimum, absolutely no attempt, and just let whatever Colm wanted to do with them completely happen. And let me know what you think down in the comment section about this theory. Do you agree? Do you disagree? And also, if you have a suggestion for any theories, feel free to post that down in the comment section below. Always taking recommendations, suggestions, anything you want to see about. Until the next video, you guys be safe.
Alright, string the no-good murdering bastard up.
Let's try this again. Where's Mike?
No.
Where's Mike?
I already told you I ain't seen him.
You lie!
It ain't my fault. He tried to kill me.
Where's Micah?
Talk, or I'll pull this lever.
Talk!
No.
Could Cleet have been redeemed, or is this a dry case of automatically guilty by association? Cleet is one of the smaller characters in the story of Red Dead Redemption 2. We have no information on what his last name is, possible aliases he went by, or previous affiliations besides running with Micah Bell and Joe, another character that's only known by one name. Cleet, and by extension Joe, are only in a handful of cutscenes throughout the entire game of Red Dead Redemption 2, with their first appearances being during the main mission, My Last Boy.
So why are these two still here?
Old pals of Micah's.
They're getting real comfortable.
We need guns for what's coming. Cleet and Joe know how to fight. It's lucky I bumped into them.
Although it's worth noting, as a token of Rockstar's great writing, you can actually see Cleet and Joe wandering around camp a little bit before they are introduced to Arthur in the main story mission. But clearly, understandably, Arthur is naturally standoffish and aggressive towards both of them. I mean, given Micah's well-established reputation within the gang at this point, I think anyone that knows Micah from his earlier years and chooses to ride with him again should be seen as someone who's possibly as deplorable as Micah himself. And Cleet and Joe are already introduced to the Van der Linde gang, or rather what remains of it, at the worst possible time, to say the least. Tension is at an all-time high for everyone that remains at Beaver Hollow. The Pinkertons are close on the gang's tail. Dutch and Micah are continuing to get closer to each other, feeding into one another's own greed and recklessness. John and Arthur are starting to develop their own sense of what is right and wrong with the change and their own priorities, which in turn causes its own wedge between not only them and Dutch, but the rest of the members, such as Bill and Javier, who, if you hang around camp long enough at certain points, can be seen calling John or even Arthur a traitor, telling them what they're doing is hurting Dutch and they should stop it, that they've changed. It's hard to precisely describe the tension and mentality that is surrounding everyone because, to oversimplify it, the prevailing sides are John and Arthur, trying to split off and do their own thing, versus Micah and Dutch continuing on in the philosophy of what Dutch claims they've always been after. Only now it's through much more reckless and dangerous means. But to dig a little deeper within that camp of Dutch and Micah, I still believe the majority of people aware of what Micah and Dutch are doing and saying Dutch has changed is them more so trying to rationalize everything. It's a point of self-evaluation and retrospectively looking at their entire life. Because the man they've looked up to, the man that they've trusted so much in, is drastically different than what he's always been. I ultimately think that even though at some points they question whether if Dutch was always like this, the blame is still placed on Micah. There's still a love, there's still some sense of loyalty to Dutch. Micah has none of that from any of them, so it's much easier for them to just place it on Micah and grasping at any and every possibility to rationalize the person that Dutch has become or that Dutch is now. But regardless of how much power or influence Micah genuinely has or is perceived to have on Dutch, John, Arthur, and everyone else who somewhat stays still believes Micah's the primary source of everything. And it's with that belief that makes Joe and Cleet even worse. From the perspectives of John, Sadie, and Arthur. Just the way the two of them are around the camp, never venturing far from Dutch's tent, not really seen interacting with anyone besides themselves and Micah. The body language and their lack of enthusiasm to engage with anyone else that isn't Micah or maybe even possibly Dutch just goes to show they know that they are not welcomed. And yet here, they're basically treading on ground that they were never even really welcome to begin with. And knowing they are here in the good graces of the one that is blamed for the gang's current internal struggles definitely does not help their case. Now, I wanted to put a big emphasis on Cleet's introduction to John, Sadie, and Arthur because since we don't know much about Cleet before being brought around as a hired gunman by Micah and a lack of details pertaining to what he got involved with after the events of Beaver Hollow make it difficult to make a sound judgment on whether if Cleet could have been excused. And I think the possibility of him being excused is both real and almost a definitive no. From Sadie and John's perspective, Cleet's fate was always sealed. Because frankly, from a loyalty perspective, I don't think Sadie or John would have ever allowed him to live and redeem himself if he was even capable and willing to live a straight and honest life. John and Sadie basically handed out Cleet's death sentence, a death sentence that results in either John hanging him to death.
Stop! Wait. He's up in the mountains. I think he's up in Mount Hagen. He got a whole gang now. Bad man, doing bad things. I tried to stop him from murdering that little girl. We fell out. Honest. Please, I'm one of the good guys.
Hang him.
No. There ain't no need for this. He's done.
Thank you.
Or Sadie shooting him in the head. There's no option for him to live as far as the two of them are concerned, and that is even though he made it apparent that Micah quote-unquote tried to kill him, that they fell out because he decided to try and get in the way and save a little girl from being killed by Micah. He even says that he's one of the good guys. John and Sadie are ultimately on their path to getting their revenge on Micah. By association to the man they loathe so much, a man who they blame for the death of Arthur. I mean, we can't forget, Arthur practically asked Sadie to stick with him and John in exchange for his help in finishing off the rest of the O'Driscolls out in Hanging Dog Ranch.
I'll tell you, I'll do it, but there's something you can help me with.
Sure.
You, me, and John. This whole thing is pretty much done, but Dutch still has our money hidden away, so
Well, how do you mean?
when the time comes, just be ready.
What do you mean?
I mean, if we can get out of here with money, you and me, we're more ghosts than people. And none of that loyalty matters.
Jesus. Okay. I'm with you.
Well, then you got yourself a gun.
John obviously owed his entire second chance at trying to live an honest life to Arthur, and Charles developed a strong bond and deeper level of respect for Arthur after he helped out with the Wapiti situation. So from a loyalty perspective, the three of them would not let Cleet live. I think it would just boil down to the fiercest level of an eye for an eye from their perspective. My brother died and it's your leader's fault, so we're gonna wipe any trace of him and any connection he's ever had. His pleas for mercy ultimately just falls on deaf ears because they don't care. Their goal is just to find Micah. By running with someone so ruthless, then there's nothing more fitting than the ruthless end to your own run, regardless of how noble a single act of kindness was. But let's say that Cleet never had the original presence in Beaver Hollow. Would he have still been killed? Unless John or Sadie witness Cleet spare a child or be actively challenging Micah's more brutal tendencies, then I would still say, yes, I think he would still be killed. His fate would be the same. I think that's just based off of John and Sadie's feelings towards Micah, and possibly anybody that's affiliated with him or was willing to run with him. There would be no sympathy for those types of people as far as they're concerned. Only with his lack of a presence in Beaver Hollow would now render him even more of an insignificant character, mainly just serving as a worm to inform us where Micah is. He would still be killed, just without a second thought now, because who cares? His main purpose is just to die and tell us where Micah's at. And there's one more reason that works against Cleet's favor, and that is Sadie's newfound profession. She's a bounty hunter. We've seen countless missions where, even in the main story, how relentless, aggressive, and brutal Sadie can be herself. And the way that she was able to track Cleet down in Strawberry was because there was rumors that one of Micah's affiliates, someone who's wanted for murder himself, is hiding out in Strawberry. I find it very difficult to see her overlooking this bounty. I don't think she would let him go. I think it would just boil down to killing him, moving on, coming back, and trying to reclaim that bounty of whatever price that was on Cleet's head. I just don't see it in her to let him slide, or any situation where she would grant a little mercy and allow him to run off. Maybe as a head start, sure. Yeah, she could toy with him in that way, but there is no legitimate second chances or turning over a new leaf, not based off the history that we have here. Let's say in an alternate history, he was spared by both Sadie and John. Would he be redeemed? Well, just trying to save a little girl, which he failed at, doesn't warrant him being a good guy all of a sudden. It doesn't change the person he is or what he's done any more than Arthur reluctantly saving the German family at the end of Horseshoe Overlook.
Ein großer Mann.
Ja, wirklich.
Es ist ein Segen, dass wir Sie getroffen haben.
Come on, now get out of here. This place ain't safe. Get out of here!
Ja, ja, alles klar.
Vamos!
Ich hab was für Sie. Einen Moment. Dankeschön. Thank you. Vielen Dank, herzlichen Dank.
Guess it was a pleasure.
Considering Cleet stood up to Micah and ultimately left, it does show he has more of a moral compass than Joe or anyone else that stood by Micah's side, so for Cleet there is some kind of hope, but we can't say definitively because we frankly don't know much about him or what he's done. His past can be as vague as any random NPC, or it could be as brutal and as cold-blooded as low honor Arthur. Is there a chance? Yeah. Can you say that? Can I say that definitively without a shadow of a doubt? No. Just based frankly off what we have. There's even the possibility of him finding a woman, settling down and going the route of John and completely flipping his mentality and abandoning his outlaw lifestyle. Something Amos, Micah's brother, seems to have done. But let me know what you think. Do you think Cleet would have been able to be redeemed if Sadie or John allowed him to live? Do you think Sadie or John would have even allowed him to live, or you think it's as cut and dry as Rockstar made it out to be and there's no alternative there? I'd love to hear what you guys think, and like always, I'll be down in the comment section interacting with you. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Who is the true villain of Red Dead Redemption 2? I want you to think about that. I'm sure as I ask that question, a lot of different characters, or one primary one, might pop into mind, with that being Micah.
Was you followed? No. Was you followed? I said no.
Okay.
What is your problem?
What is your problem, partner? You don't look so good.
What is wrong with you?
Nothing wrong with me. I'm fit as a fiddle.
And not inside you ain't.
I'm just a realist, friend.
And honestly, if you take a step back, many characters throughout this game have done horrible things and have been the main villain of someone else's story. To the Downs family, it's Arthur. To Dutch, it could be Colm, it could be Leviticus Cornwall, could be Agent Milton. To the Wapiti Indians, it's Leviticus and the U.S. Army. If we take characters that we know ultimately end up dying, to the Braithwaites and Greys, it's the Vanderlyn gang. To the majority of us, it's Micah, and ultimately Dutch. But if Red Dead Redemption 2 is all about the Vanderlyn gang, the story of Dutch Vanderlyn and how this gang ultimately fell apart, then an argument could be made that the gang itself is Dutch.
In that case, it'd be my honor to join you. Excuse me, friends. I have an appointment to keep with...
And if the story of this game is all about the life or the ending of the gang's life, can we really say Dutch is the true antagonist here? The ultimate villain? Or even Micah himself? Sure, you can say that Micah is an agitator and he's definitely an irritant, but he's an irritant from Arthur's perspective. From a possible false misunderstanding that the Vanderlyn gang is all about everybody within the gang and not Dutch as an entity. A while back I made a video on the channel asking why the major antagonists in the game aren't really seen, and the majority of people commented because the antagonists aren't who we think they are. In that video I cite Agent Milton, I cite Leviticus Cornwall, and I cite Colm O'Driscoll as the primary antagonists, and we rarely see them. The primary responses in the comments section was, well, that's because those aren't the antagonists. The antagonists we see almost 24/7. They're there within camp with us. And they say, it's Micah Bell and Dutch Vanderlyn.
We ain't so good at doing scores anymore, Dutch.
Are you feeling all right, Arthur? Well, Arthur needs to rest.
But is it really them? I guess to answer this question, we should look at what the story of Red Dead Redemption aims to achieve. Because it's not really a story about Arthur Morgan. Don't get me wrong, I love him. He's my favorite protagonist of any video game, period. Watching his transformation as a highly respected and ruthless enforcer to see him as a very complex character. He comes off one-dimensional originally, and then you find out along the way he's got a love interest. He had a wife and a son at a time. He cares for others within the gang more deeply than anyone could ever have imagined him to be capable of. And we watch in utter sadness as this man who we spent the better half of 30 plus hours playing as start to wither away, become a shell of his former self, get sidestepped and even talked down to by people who wouldn't even dare look at him in the eyes at the start of the game.
Why don't you shut up?
all right.
Who's this, your daddy?
My daddy died. And this man, he killed him. What are you doing here?
Leave the boy alone.
Why'd you kill his daddy? You after his mama?
Stop bullying the boy.
Get out of my business, mister.
Leave the boy alone.
Or what?
Or I'll kill you too.
You couldn't kill no one. Look at you, all ragged and sick and weak. Clear off, you goddamn hermit.
Arthur and his transformation from the beginning of the game to the end is moving to say the least. It's thought-provoking and tear-jerking, but this isn't his story. If it was, the game would end when Arthur takes his last breath. And if the credits are really meant to roll, when he dies, then why not just reset us as Arthur, plop us back in the middle of the world, give us everything that we achieved as far as gear and outfits goes, and then just allow us to live our outlaw fantasy, continuing our days as Arthur, knowing that, canonically speaking, as far as the narrative is concerned, this world saw Arthur die on that mountaintop. And you could say, by that logic, technically, Red Dead Redemption isn't about John either, but rather Jack. I would say between those two games that's not exactly true, and it's not the same case because unlike the first game where there may be a few stranger missions you can complete as Jack and there's a revenge mission for him, there isn't an entire chapter or even two filled with a series of missions setting him up for his coming of age, so to speak. Red Dead Redemption 2, while there's a lot to be desired in its actual execution, still spends a significant amount of time trying to wrap up the characters from the main chunk of the story, and bridge the gap on John's side of events from the second game into the first. Is it trying to do too much? Probably, most likely, but that doesn't mean the focus isn't shifting from one protagonist to another. With this being a prequel after all, Rockstar had a lot of questions to answer in order to connect the first game in a very satisfying way, which they probably could have gotten away with if they chose to even opt out of giving us the epilogue altogether. But if Colm, Cornwall, Milton, or Dutch, and even Micah aren't the villain per se, at least not the main villain, who is it? From my opinion, it's us. It's the world that we're living in. It's the turn of the century. Civilization's grip on the wild, untamed lands is starting to tighten, and the way of life, our way of life, the things we've grown accustomed to, how we stay afloat, how we rely on one another. Sure, the ways may be wrong, morally unjust, ethically questionable, but it's still a lifestyle that we are known to have, and it's all being slowly suffocated to death.
We can't stay here. That much is obvious. Where are we gonna run to? I mean, they chased us from the west, they chased us over the mountains, they ran us into the sea.
Arthur, do you have my back?
Always, Dutch. But there's more than your back to worry about.
The environment, the world, the people. It's a battle of two ways of life. The savage, outdated gunslingers, pitted against the sleek modern-day enforcers of civilization. If the latter was to be placed in the form of a person, then I would argue it would be either Leviticus Cornwall, a ruthless business mogul that has a hand in nearly every corner of Red Dead Redemption's universe. On a smaller scale, it could by extension be Angelo Bronte or even Agent Milton. Bronte represents the corruption of Saint Denis after all, having his hands in illegal businesses such as the Braithwaite moonshine operation we have to smash during the chapter of Clemens Point. Yet, Bronte still had the Saint Denis police force in his pocket.
So, you walk into my city, stinking of shit and looking like this, and you come into my house before you have a bath and you tell me how to act? You ask me to show compassion. Have I not shown you almost infinite compassion already by simply allowing you to breathe in my presence?
Agent Milton, on the other hand, or I guess the entirety of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, was directly funded by Cornwall, with increased pressure to hunt Dutch down and eradicate him as a threat. Technically, even the Gray family can be considered not too different, as they do control the law enforcement in and around the town of Rhodes. Principally, it's almost the same, just the Grays are stuck in their tiny bubble of the town of Rhodes. From the other side of the fence, the Vanderlyn gang, Dutch himself, embodies the brutal ways of life, and Dutch romanticizing the outlaw lifestyle, appearing to be the savior of those who refuse or don't have a place in the new era of a blooming society. With Red Dead Redemption 2 set to be a prequel, really its main purpose was to just give us context and insight to the lives of John Marston and what his relationship was like to Dutch and his position within the Vanderlyn gang at large. Arthur was just created to be the perfect vessel to witness all of that. Realistically speaking, Arthur is never mentioned in the first game because, truth be told, the original Red Dead Redemption had a high likelihood of being a one-off. If it flopped, oh well. If it does good, great. But if it does amazing, at least for what Rockstar was expecting, now they have to deliver on trying to establish a more solid game series. One that has some solid potential. And what would be an easier way than to just explore a little of John's past? If Rockstar ever chooses to do a proper remake, it would be ideal for them to rewrite some of the original material from the first game, because even though the game is written and presented in a way that doesn't immediately have glaring or questionable issues, the only major one being John's lack of mentioning Arthur, who is almost solely responsible for his second chance at life, outside of the Vanderlyn gang, if you look deeper, there's a lot more pressing issues and more to be desired when it comes to other characters and why they aren't properly explored in Red Dead Redemption 2. But going back to what I was saying, from Arthur's perspective, Micah is the villain. He's the one to place the entire blame of everything on. Towards the end of the game, he even starts to shift on placing the blame of Dutch losing his mind, so he would say it's the both of them. Dutch changed. Micah pushed him to change.
What is going on, Dutch? What is happening to us? What's happening to you?
From Arthur's perspective, from our perspective, Micah's the villain. If the story is all about the collapse of the Vanderlyn gang, well, that becomes a little bit more complex, but I still think it boils down to it being Micah. After all, Micah does the one thing that all the members kind of refrain from, and that's pushing Dutch to be more greedy. He's the yes man. He appeals to the side of Dutch that is eager to kill, is eager to rob, is eager to cause as much noise and chaos as humanly possible. And it leads us as players to question if that side of Dutch was always there, hidden underneath the surface, or that's just Dutch changing, tired of being beat down by a system, by a world that doesn't want him anymore, that continues to paint him as the bad guy, a ruthless manipulator, a vengeful, cold-blooded killer, an outlaw just like the rest of them. And Dutch, always trying to stand out from the rest of the outlaws, just got sick and tired of it. Fine, I'm gonna be exactly what they're painting me to be, and I'm going to enjoy every second of it.
I'll tell you what, you give me this ship, $10,000 and safe passage out of here,
I'll let you live. I'll do no such thing. You sure? Good. I prefer it this way.
I don't think there's any one true villain. I think it depends on what angle you're looking at. Like I said, some people brand Dutch as the villain. Others say it's Micah, which yes, but the reasons behind why it would be considered Micah are misinformed or diluted. Micah's branded the villain just because they don't like him. Just because they don't like how he treats Arthur. I'm not justifying it. Micah's still a piece of shit at the end of the day. I'm simply saying, if Micah's to be the villain, it would be because he had a critical role in pushing Dutch into more and more reckless behavior that arguably put the entire gang at increasing risk. And whether if Dutch is to be the villain or not depends on what the Van der Linde gang is. Is the gang Dutch? In which case, no, the villain strictly is Micah. Is the gang all the people rallying underneath Dutch? Then yes, the villain arguably is more Dutch than Micah. Because I pointed out before, Micah does not control Dutch. When Angelo Bronte betrayed Dutch and lied to him about the trolley station out in Saint Denis being a lucrative and easy take, Arthur writes in his journal that nobody wants to talk to Dutch about Bronte, especially Micah. Micah refuses to mention Bronte's name because Dutch is erratic, he's volatile. He's looking for any and every reason to go after Bronte, to find some way to get this man even for playing him for a fool, for setting him up, for almost getting him killed. And that can be one of those tiny pieces of information where it can be said to not look too deep into it, but it's the only piece of information that we have that gives us an insight to what the relationship or dynamic is between Dutch and Micah. And I've said it before, Arthur's journal is a valuable resource when it comes to any type of information, any type of insight, not just from Arthur's perspective, but just the camp and other characters at large. There's so much that isn't shown or said through direct cutscenes or through mission dialogue, and you can have an idea from the mission dialogue or from the cutscene, but when you look into Arthur's journal, it concretely solidifies what you had an idea of. And it's really with that small comment that more supports the idea that Dutch was always like that, or just through the events of the game. He starts being pushed more and more in that direction, and Micah's just the yes man. Yes, boss. You always figure it out, boss. You got it. You know I have your back, Dutch. Whereas before, he had the console and more reasonable mentality of Hosea and Arthur in his ear. Now he has Micah, who just doesn't care. He takes pleasure in the violence, in the chaos, and he cares only for a payday. But that's my take on who the true villain of Red Dead Redemption 2 is. I could have made this a 30-second video and just be like, it's Micah, or it's Dutch because X, Y, and Z, but I wanted to present this topic in a different light where you can have some type of discussion, some type of discourse of really who is the ones at fault. What angle are you really looking at here to say, yes, this guy's the villain because of this? And I would love to have this conversation and discussion continued down below in the comments section. So please, let me know what you think. What's your perspective on all of this? Like always, thank you so much for watching. If you're brand new to the channel, maybe consider subscribing. Or if you have any recommendations or suggestions on video ideas for the future, let me know. I have a lineup of videos coming out within this next week that people are throwing my way. So I'm always reading the comments and I'm always taking suggestions. But until the next video, I'll see you all then.
You'll be dead, sure. But I'm gonna be just fine. We offered you a deal, Mr. Morgan. You should have taken it.
I'm a fool, Mr. Milton.
Not all you boys have quite so many scruples. Old Micah Bell.
Micah? You mean Molly?
Molly O'Shea? Sweated her a couple of times, never talked a word, had to let her go. Micah Bell. We picked him up when you boys came back from the Caribbean, and he's been a good boy ever since.
Did Agent Milton lie to Arthur about Micah working with the Pinkertons? And if so, why? So this is something that has always been a question of mine. And it's not because I like Micah or anything of the sort. If you look at my videos, I try to actually look at all the characters we see in the game and analyze their actions, personality, and pretty much everything else that we tend to evaluate in order to judge the merits of a person's character. And I try to do that in as much of an unbiased or prejudiced way as possible. And honestly, no matter how you slice it, at the end of the day, Micah is still a horrible person. He receives a letter from his brother basically telling him if he ever sees him again, he will kill Micah. Just because the moment he became a father, he vowed to protect his kids from any kind of evil in this world. An evil that he says Micah specifically embodies. That should be enough to tell you how bad of a person Micah is, but it's not. Rockstar gives us plenty of other examples, such as watching him kick the camp dog.
Get out of here, you damn parasite!
I was told you can even find him pushing Jack occasionally around camp. To be honest with you, I tried finding some footage, but I can't find anything that doesn't show Jack being abused by some character that's modded, basically. So whether if you can actually find Micah pushing Jack or not, I've never witnessed it myself, and I've never found pure footage for that. But if it does happen, please let me know where and how you can get that to basically happen. And if you don't mind, maybe consider hitting the subscribe button if you like what you see. But moving on, that is just scratching the surface of Micah. Throughout Beaver Hollow, we see Micah poking fun of Arthur for being sick countless of times, and how Micah enjoys finally being Dutch's lapdog, all too happy to push John and Arthur to the wayside.
And Cowpoke, take it easy. You could do with a vacation,
Again, not a good person. His likability and morality, though, are not the same as his weapon skill or how deadly of a person Micah is. All BS aside, Micah is objectively a very valuable asset. Provided he listens and doesn't go off doing what he does best, tormenting innocent people, he is a skilled gunslinger. And provided if events were different, circumstances were different, I think the duo or even trio between Arthur and Micah, or Arthur, Micah, and John would have been an insane group of men to cross. In a way, an argument can also be made that although Micah liked to, in his own words, annoy Arthur, there isn't any concrete malice from him towards Arthur, at least not at the start of the game. Not to the point where anyone can really definitively say Micah does not like him. Does he see Arthur as a threat at the start? 100%. Does he test the water and continuously back down in the beginning? Not willing to experience firsthand what Arthur's capable of doing? Without a doubt. But the thing is, when it comes to the writing and all the characters presented within this game, just enough is left open to interpretation that some characters, some relationships, some instances can be given the benefit of the doubt or even looked at entirely differently. There's so much ambiguity at times that there's enough credence to theories some people would never expect, other rats beyond just Micah. Some people say, could have been John, could have been Abigail, could have been Pearson, Trelawney. I even heard someone say one time Arthur might have been a snitch himself and went down a rabbit hole. But the point is, there's enough open where you can give the benefit of the doubt in certain instances. And Micah is a very complex character. He's not exactly one-dimensional. He was portrayed so well that a lot of people hate him. It's not unjustified, but it's hard to say for sure if he genuinely respected and liked Arthur at the start of the game. And because of Arthur getting sick and his mentality changing, and him going from doing any and everything that it took to please Dutch and satisfy the gang, to now doing anything and everything he can to save as many lives as he could, in a mind such as Micah, that could be seen as weakness. And just how we can be disappointed in family members, brothers, friends, fathers, cousins, uncles, and we start treating them differently, or we start poking fun at what we perceive as weakness, or if they betrayed us and we're upset about it. Some people like to agitate and lash out. Doing just this fits Micah's personality to a T. In a weird way, if Rockstar chose to expand more on the dynamic and relationship between Micah and Arthur, it may well have been more interesting than the relationship between Arthur and John. Because even Arthur's ruthlessly pragmatic at times. Micah, even when he crossed the line, had Dutch's protection, and there's not a sibling rivalry between Micah and Arthur as there is with Arthur and John. So there's no bringing up the past or irrelevant stuff from your childhood. It's simply your mistakes and what you do at this point in time. Everything that happened as a child is irrelevant. It's all about what you're doing now, how it affects the gang, how it affects us in this current bank robbery, stagecoach robbery, or anything else that they're getting into at the time. But I always wanted to see the relationship, or lack of one, further explored. Mike is only ever seen in a light that agitates Arthur and causes problems, making us hate him all the more. Again, not defending him, I'm just saying how differently some of our opinions may have been swayed by a mission or two where the dynamic between Arthur and Micah is further explored. I mean, think of all the people who, after seeing Micah's reaction when Sean got killed, at least had respect for his weapon handling skills after that mission. They may all hate him still, he still sucks ass as a character, but this simple show of what he can do is enough to garner players' respect as a gunslinger. But going back to Milton, why do I think he would even lie about Micah? Well, let's consider the history and what Milton knows about the gang. Let's do it working backwards. In the final exchange between Milton and Arthur, Milton claims Micah's been the rat the entire time. Arthur, surprised, responds with no. Doesn't he mean Molly?
We offered you a deal, Mr. Morgan. Should have taken it.
I'm a fool, Mr. Milton.
Not all you boys have quite so many scruples. Old Micah Bell?
Micah? You mean Molly?
Molly O'Shea? Sweated her a couple of times, never talked a word, had to let her go. Micah Bell. We picked him up when you boys came back from the Caribbean, and he's been a good boy ever since.
Arthur believed it was Molly because Molly herself claimed she was the one feeding information to the Pinkertons out of anger. Dutch wasn't giving her the attention she demanded, so consequently she claims she told the Pinkertons everything. Molly appeared to be drunk and was visibly upset upon this revelation. Needless to say, the mixture of being angry and alcohol leads people to say and do moronic things. She's been sidestepped this entire time, and it appears Dutch only gives his attention to those that could only further his interests at the time. Interest that typically revolves around money or getting the law off of their backs. Molly could very well have felt neglected and powerless to help the gang, powerless to help Dutch, and forced to up and move time and time again. With a final time in the midst of the aftermath of the failed Saint-Denis bank robbery. Angry, and maybe finally feeling she can have one over Dutch, the man that had paid so little attention to her this entire time, her way of getting even was taking credit for the hardship this man has endured, without thinking this may cost her life. Angry, spiteful, vengeful, anything to feel better about ourselves, to get even with those that have made us feel like fools. I don't think it's completely out of the norm for her version of telling Dutch and everyone else around here, fuck you, by admitting all the shit they're being dragged through, all the hardship that they're having to deal with. Yeah, that's thanks to her. An interesting idea to bring up is, even if Milton denied Molly snitching, we can at least confirm she has been picked up at least once. Milton says he sweated her a few times and Molly did admit to talking, so between the two of them, she had to have been addressed at least once by the Pinkertons. Maybe she was the rat and slowly leaked information, going more and more in depth as Dutch's negligence towards her continued. Maybe, seeing how close Micah was slowly getting to Dutch, she struck up a deal and asked Milton to place Micah as the rat. And as early as Horseshoe Overlook, Micah can be seen sucking up to Dutch, telling him how incredible he is, how special he is, how there's no one that he's ever met that's remotely close to him. Who's to say Micah didn't drive a wedge, making Molly more resentful at the two of them? Revealing to Milton exactly who Micah was, the extent he's willing to go, and admitting he's far more unpredictable and worse than Arthur ever was. I wish there was more information out there tied to how much the world or just the Pinkertons knows about each individual Van der Linde member, and to what extent their affiliation with the gang or even to Dutch is, because it would make a lot of speculation so much easier, and I wouldn't have to constantly refer to this one and only scene where Milton addresses the gang in a somewhat diplomatic way, because in this one interaction, we don't see every single Van der Linde gang member. They're not all present. It looks like Milton's aware of who Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur are. Of course, Hosea is assumed, Arthur, Milton already met, and John, well, he's Rip Van Winkle.
Good day, fine people. Mr. Van der Linde, Mr. Matthews, I presume. And who are you?
Rip Van Winkle.
Huh. Good day, sir.
If we go off of this cutscene alone, Milton appears to have very limited knowledge of each individual gang member, the actual numbers in each individual member's rap sheet, both what they have done on their own volition or tied to other gangs, and then what they have done for this specific gang. And as I said a moment ago, Micah unfortunately is not in this cutscene, which does give credence to Micah working with the Pinkertons sooner rather than later. That is not the timeline Milton gives us, though. On the one hand, Micah isn't always present. If Milton said he was working with him all along, long before the Saint-Denis bank robbery went downhill, or during the middle of the gang getting involved in the rivalry between the Greys and the Braithwaites, that would have been much more believable because we can't account for what Micah's up to during that time. It's not until Beaver Hollow, where we see the most of him, and during the events of Clement's Point, Micah is possibly even working with the O'Driscolls, or at least actively looking for a way to get rid of Arthur, as seen with his lack of enthusiasm upon Arthur's return to camp. Something you would think he would look at as a blessing. Dutch constantly shows an eagerness to deal with Colm any chance he gets. Would this not be the prime opportunity for Micah to come up to Dutch and propose a plan to get rid of his rival once and for all? His rival who crossed the line by kidnapping Arthur, playing them all for a bunch of fools. This gives even more suspicion that he plays a hand in Arthur's kidnapping at the hands of Colm's men from the very start. But let's not get distracted. Guarma, or after Guarma, is where Milton places Micah's cooperation. I find that a little difficult to believe because of a few reasons. You're going to tell me Micah was picked up by the Pinkertons by mistake? This slimy bastard that always has his guard up is fully aware of the heat he and the rest of the gang members returning from Guarma will have on him, managed to slip and get captured? How is he the only one to be captured? Better yet, if he got picked up immediately after Guarma, why would he tell the Pinkertons the gang is hiding out in Lakay Lake and put himself in a position of harm's way? Milton immediately opens fire on the shack.
To arrest you! Come out with your hands up!
Give them to a count of 5, then give them everything. Actually, let them have it.
Down!
The same shack Micah himself is hiding in. Unless Milton does what Ross does in the first game and already made up his mind that these are horrible men, horrible people that cannot be trusted or allowed to live, there's no reformation or redemption whatsoever. It's plausible then that Milton promised Micah some kind of clemency, and then here and now saw a golden opportunity to just rid everyone at the same time. And Micah, unknowing Milton, was going to arrive with a full Maxim gun and an entire army set to just kill, placed himself in the shack, unaware of the firepower that Milton was just going to arrive with, or the fact that he was going to be placed in front of said firepower. And with all of that considered, that brings another question. When, if Micah really was working with the Pinkertons, did his cooperation begin? How does this fit within the overall timeline? Milton claims it's after Guarma. I placed his cooperation immediately after returning to the area from Guarma, but right before uniting with everyone at Lakay Lake, which I couldn't find a smooth place to say this in, so I'm gonna say it here. I really do think the Pinkertons fighting the entire gang hiding out in the swamps here was Bill's own recklessness.
Well, here you is! Well, I asked everyone I could find, and eventually someone new said you fools were out here!
Especially if you put into account how Milton shows up, and again, Micah being in the shack with everyone else just doesn't make that much sense when you start to break it down. It's much more plausible that after the gang was ambushed at Lakay Lake, sometime while they were relocating from here to Beaver Hollow, Micah was then snatched up by the Pinkertons, and that's when the cooperation with them could have began. But as far as timelines and direct events we witnessed firsthand between Micah being placed in harm's way from the Pinkertons and what Milton claims is the true beginning of Micah's cooperation with them, this would be the most viable option. Yet even then, we would be looking over some key details. Just looking at how Milton is during this mission in Lakay Lake. He's visibly agitated, at the end of his wits with this gang of savages, a gang of murderers and thieves that he's tried to reason with, and each time they spit in his face, slapped his olive branch away, and continued on doing something that would only increase their notoriety and consequently the pressure Milton is under to apprehend this gang. After he met with Arthur in Horseshoe Overlook, Milton gave Arthur an opportunity to hand over Dutch and walk away. Arthur instead chose to stay loyal.
We got a problem. What? I just met some guys out near the river. A fella named, Milton, and, I don't remember the other fella's name. Ross. Milton and Ross. And they are employees of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And they know about the train, and they know we're here.
Were you followed back here?
No, they know we're near here. And they want you, Dutch.
And the gang went on to rob a train, shoot up Valentine, go back later and rob the Bank of Valentine, get involved with the rivalry between the Greys and Braithwaites, destroying the history of the local area by shooting up the town of Rhodes and burning down Braithwaite Manor. Events that probably came to Milton's attention after he approached the entire gang at Clemens Point, attempting to reason with them again, asking for just Dutch, and in exchange they will be given 3 days to leave, disappear, and live decent lives somewhere else. He says, in 3 days' time I'll be back with 50 men. Who's to say when he returns? At this point in time, now he finds out Braithwaite Manor was burned down, Rhodes was shot up, and the gang is no longer in the area. Of course, they resettle over in Sadie Bell, where they shoot up Sadie Bell, take it over from the Lemoyne Raiders, and then get involved with the politics of Saint-Denis, eventually killing Angelo Bronte, attempting to rob the trolley station, accused of stealing from the mayor of Saint-Denis, and even robbed the ferry in the harbor of Saint-Denis, all culminating in them robbing the giant bank of Saint-Denis, where Milton manages to capture at least Hosea. In the previous interactions, Milton may have talked down to these criminals, but at least he tried to reason with them. Now in the middle of Saint-Denis, his tactics and feelings are very different. As he says, he's given them their chances, they made their decisions, now it's death.
It's over! No more bargains, no more deals.
Mr. Milton, this is America. You can always cut a deal.
I've given you enough chances.
Come on!
And it's here in the middle of Saint-Denis where, for the first time, he arrives with a massive amount of manpower. Pinkertons and law enforcement on every single corner. This was him showing he means business. He will not be taken for a fool. And he follows this up with the second show of power, of strength, of how little he really cares for them or their lives. Horseshoe overlooking Clemens Point marks 2 points where he tries to reason with them. And the gang is really in a position where they still have members that may not be considered that deadly. They're not entirely all gunslingers, murderers. They may be considered thieves, but they're not to the same caliber as Arthur, Micah, or even Bill or Javier. They're not all enforcers. Going from Clemens Point to Saint-Denis, we see Milton be much more aggressive. He ramps it up because time and again, they spit in his face. This time, while there may be civilians and chances for innocent people to be killed, for the most part, he can take out all the enforcers, all the gunslingers, all the specific murders within the gang here. And yet, they managed to escape. The next time we see him is in LeCay Lake. Everybody in the Vanderlyn gang is huddled into a small, decrepit shack. He has every single one of them right where he wants them, and they're not gonna escape. He even starts off with the countdown, and then he says, forget it, and he gives permission to open fire. Yet again, the Vanderlyn gang manages to escape, with no casualties. The next time we see him, although it's very brief, is when he was just dismissed from having a meeting with Leviticus Cornwall in Annisburg. If the gang is gonna be bold enough to venture into town and shoot the man that is actually directly funding Milton and the Pinkertons to apprehend them, on top of 2 previous instances where they pulled off this miraculous escape, where there was hundreds of men firing upon them and they somehow still managed to outgun these lawmen, these Pinkertons, at least enough to be able to pull together some type of escape. It has to have hammered home to Milton that at the end of the day, these men are incredibly skilled. They are crafty, they are clever. The final moment where Arthur has to go and save Abigail and Sadie. Yes, he provided some covering fire from a distance for Sadie, but even then, when Sadie disappears into the building, Arthur has to clear waves of men in order to make his way to the building that Sadie disappeared into, which would then mean that even if Arthur is sick, he's not weak. He still has a lot of fight left in him. So even if Arthur's on his dying bed, like so many people are quick to point out, that is true. However, we can't invalidate all the times Arthur is shown to Milton directly. His loyalty lies with Dutch. His loyalty lies to this gang. A gang that's arguably much worse and a bigger threat now than it was before. In Horseshoe Overlook, there was Hosea, there was women, there was children. Beaver Hollow, the gang is a shell of its former self. We're just looking at people like Micah, Javier, Bill, Arthur, John. Sure, Abigail and Jack is still around, but at the end of the day, there's less collateral for the gang as a whole. We just have the enforcers practically remaining. And the enforcers are blowing bridges, pushing the Wapiti Indians into increased aggression towards the United States Army. And Dutch and his goals and intentions are becoming more sporadic by the day. Milton, I believe, would have lied to Arthur in this moment because Arthur still has that fight. Yes, he might be sick, but we don't know when exactly he's going to die. He's loyal to Dutch, but maybe Milton was aware of how much he disliked Micah, and Micah was putting that wedge between Dutch and Arthur. So if Arthur was to escape this room and was to rendezvous with Dutch and the rest of whatever remained of the Vanderlyn gang, that seed of distrust, that seed of betrayal, that seed of disloyalty was starting to be planted. Micah's a skilled gunslinger. Arthur is a skilled gunslinger. This gang, or at least Arthur, believes and loyalty above everything else. It's unfortunate that we really don't know how much Milton knows about each individual gang member, but what he does know is how much Arthur values that relationship, that long-lasting time that he spent with Miss Grimshaw, with Hosea, with Dutch, with John. People that he spent a significant amount of time with. People that he holds near and dear. If Milton's made so many attempts to break the gang by reason or to demolish them through sheer manpower and firepower, and each and every single time he failed, maybe a final attempt was to rot the system from the inside out. Why keep fighting, Arthur? Why not play ball like Micah? Wouldn't that make sense, to sow a little bit of dissension? At the very least, Milton had to be aware of Dutch's increased boldness and aggressiveness, and it's unlike him, so maybe Molly did snitch and did place all this aggression, hatred that Dutch was exhibiting on not him, but on Micah. And it was easier to just tell Arthur that, hey, Micah's been working with us all along. What do you think? It was just an interesting thought that has always came to my mind. Just the way that Milton says it always made me wonder. And it's so easy for us to hate Micah, and it does make a lot of sense, but for Rockstar, the writing and the story and how everything is told within the game, it's almost too much on the nose to be like, yeah, Micah is the one to blame for all of this. Sure, maybe he did play ball, but I don't think it would have been so cut and dry the way it's presented. But let me know what you think. What's your take on that? Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Let's talk down in the comment section. I might even go a little bit more in depth into how Micah worked with the Pinkertons because it's interesting. And this may have also been something Rockstar was intentionally working on because of this little clip of John talking to Charles about Micah being a rat all along.
Micah?
I hope that bastard's dead. You know, he was the one speaking to them agents.
What?
Putting them on us the whole time. Or since before I got off Sisika.
So even John places a timeline different than Milton. And that could be through John's own hatred and dislike towards Micah, where he distorts the timeline and fits it where it makes more sense to Charles, and Charles betrays Micah. It's just interesting all around, but with whatever angle you decide to look at it, Rockstar still intentionally kept that line, John's line, in there for a reason.